So the Torah reading this week is Parshat Ki Teze, which again is filled with many, many mitzvot. I actually don't have the number, but I think it's even more than the last 2 weeks Parshiot had. And what I want to try to do is tie together a couple of these mitzvot here. And the title of the class is Eyes Wide Open. And I want to begin with a mitzvah that's very famous and very well known. It's on page 1048 in the Stone Chumash, if you're following along at home. And it's chapter 22, sentence 1. And it says, "You shall not see the ox of your brother or a sheep or goat cast off," meaning like running wild, "and hide yourself from them. You shall surely return them to your brother. If your brother is not near you, and you do not know him, then gather it inside your house, and it shall remain with you until your brother inquires after it, and you shall return it to them." And indeed, these laws are studied Talmudically oftentimes in the early stages of a person's Talmudic study. And the mitzvah is Hashavat Avedah, returning a lost object. Now, the commentaries, the Ramban included question why it's repeated here, because it's also in the book of Exodus. And what they focus in on is this idea of you shall not see the ox of your brother and hide yourself from them. And what exactly does that mean? So we know that if you walk down the street, or if two people walk down the street, they're all seeing different things. And if you ask the person to remember, do you remember this street sign? Do you remember this car was parked there? Do you remember this kid playing ball in the street? Each person's perception and memory and what they notice will be different than another person's. And that's why, indeed, if you want to really understand a full picture, you get a composite of several witnesses, several people who were in the same time, and you can put together a picture of what was really there. What's stressed here is that the normal vision of a person, what a person notices, are things that will help themselves. In other words, if I like pizza, I say, "Oh, look at that, 2 blocks down, there's a pizza store. I wonder if it's kosher." And if someone else likes a different food, that's what they see. Someone who's into baseball sees the kid playing baseball. Someone who's into cars will notice, oh, there's an unusual car on the side. How does this work? Why are people this way? And the answer is that from infancy, our eyes are in a certain sense, agents of acquisition. They're looking around. What can I take? What can I have? What do I need? What do I need to do to protect myself? What's a danger to me? But in other words, our vision becomes a reflection of our own self-interest and our own desires and wants. And I think we can understand that's common and understandable for people. You know, a little child sees another child playing with a toy. I want that toy. A minute ago, the toy was sitting there and the child did not want the toy. So we know that that's jealousy. So there's a sense that we have that in the normal course of human development, our eyes become agents of acquisition and satisfaction for me. So what is the Torah saying here? The Torah is saying you shall not see the ox of your brother and ignore it and overlook it. In other words, the Torah here is elevating me as a human being, and it's placing a responsibility on me that when I walk down the street, it's not just looking out for me, but I have to develop my vision and my awareness so that if it's your item that's running free, or your animal that's escaped from your pen, or it's your wallet that you happen to have dropped while you were rushing to work, I don't grab it for myself, but rather I develop an awareness that I see it, I notice it, and then I take responsibility to help and benefit someone else. Use this awareness, use this vision so that I can ultimately return the lost sheep, the goat, the wallet, or protect someone from a damage, fill a hole in the street because I noticed that there's a bore Bereshut Rabbim, that there's a danger or a risk factor, or there's a stumbling block that a blind person could fall over. So the Torah here is trying to, in a sense, elevate our priorities, our instinctual being, to say that the norm is for people to watch out for themselves. The Torah is adding a layer of responsibility on me to create a broader, more encompassing physical vision here. Physical vision. Now, again, I'm not committing a sin if I happen not to notice that there's a nickel laying on the side of the gutter that somebody had dropped. But the Torah places at me that, first of all, when I see something that would involve me in helping someone else, I can't turn my head. I didn't really see that. I can't push it out of my vision or out of my scope. That's a direct violation of this law. And as commentaries explain, it's really meant to ennoble my entire level of interaction with the world, that there's a benevolence, there's a concern for others, and that becomes part and parcel of the way I see the world. And you can hear that in the tone of it. You shall not see the ox of your brother and ignore it. And I just relate this very much to Moshe walking, tending to sheep, and noticing that the bush is burning and it's not being consumed. And one of the commentaries there, and I didn't look it up, says that other people walked by. Moshe wasn't the only person to tread this pathway, but they were absorbed in their own thoughts. They were absorbed in their own responsibilities. They were making sure that their sheep got home on time so that they could have lamb chops for dinner that night. That was what's on their mind. So they could walk by a phenomenon like a burning bush. They weren't sensitive to it. And indeed, in that context, different than this, the sensitivity is God's presence in the world, a sense of God's interaction with all creation. God is the creator of the world. And because Moshe had a heightened sense, in a certain sense, of seeking out God and looking for Hashem's presence, ultimately that led to him becoming the leader of the Jewish people and the redeemer of the Jewish people and taking us out of Egypt. Now, what people like Rav Shamshon Hirsch say, this changes the whole quality of society. If this mitzvah, as this mitzvah would take hold and grow within a person, we would become such a caring society. We in theory could reach an idealistic state where if I'm going to work, I say, gee, my wallet fell out of my pocket. I'm not even going to look for it now because I'm busy. I have to get to where I'm going. I'm sure someone else is going to pick it up. They're going to put up a little sign in the shul or on the marketplace. They're going to say, wallet found. So I'll retrieve my wallet later because a good-natured fellow Jew who's upholding the concepts of the Torah is bound to pick it up. And if no one notices it, so I'll go back and get it later. It'll be sitting there. And it creates a situation where of mutual trust, of mutual concern for one another. And you can see how this would just boomerang into a society that is completely different than the norm of society we have today. And indeed, if you look at even at the Stone Chumash, concern for the property or another, concern for the well-being of another. So in a certain sense, we would all, to use a teaching idea, we would all develop that third eye, which is basically looking out for the good of the others around me, of my neighbors and my friends, and even my enemies. Because after all, if my enemy is struggling with a load on the back of his donkey, I need to stop and help him as well. So it just changes my whole scope of vision, and ultimately it changes the nature of society in general. And in an interesting way, I just want to mention something that Rav Hirsch points out. The sentence before, at the end of chapter 21, talks about the commitment society has to have to bury the dead. And even if we execute someone, the person has to be buried that same day. And we know that Jewish tradition is that we're meticulous in burying the dead for their own dignity. And what Hirsch points out is this is a reliance on society at large, if you think about it, because each and every human being who passes out of this world, the dignified conclusion for that life is to be buried properly, but a person can't do that for themselves. And it's not a question of me paying someone or hiring someone. It becomes part of the social compact or the social connection we have with one another, that when any of us face the end of our mortal life. And when we pass out of this world, the Torah wants us to have a certainty that the rest of the society will notice, will regard this as a milestone that's of importance to all, and therefore the remains of the person will naturally be dealt with in a dignified way. Now, this concept of retraining our vision, so to speak, or reprogramming our whole level of interaction with the world so that it becomes one that's marked by benevolence and kindness and concern for others, and it's overriding some of the more base traits of jealousy, wanting to steal what everybody else has, wanting everything for myself, wanting to only protect my own property, in Proverbs in chapter 23, sentence 26, there's a sentence that reads as follows, where the sentence says, "Give your heart to me, my son, and let your eyes observe my ways." And this is God speaking to the Jewish people, so to speak. And what the added dimension that this sentence brings in is the idea that your heart initiates and the eyes follow through. And this really is an illustration of the concept we're talking about. Because how does it work? In other words, I'm a regular human being. I'm growing up. I'm at an immature state of my spiritual, moral development. So my tendency is, I want it, it's mine. Just like when you walk into a preschool, like I say, if you go into a 2-3-year-old classroom, the only word you will hear children uttering regularly is mine, 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 mine. If you sit down to eat and a kid notices another kid has a snack that they like, mine, that's all they say. So to elevate and grow beyond that, what the Proverbs is telling us that it's really a retraining of the heart. And I want to get a little bit clarity with this heart and mind thing. And what we really see this in the third paragraph of the Shema, which is in Bamidbar, and I didn't write down the chapter and verse, but it's in the end of Parshat Shlach. I think it's right around chapter 16. I'm not sure. We'll have to look it up. We say there below, Taturu, don't go after acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem, after your heart and after your eyes. That's what the sentence says. And there the Medrash asks very directly. It says, what do you mean after your heart and after your eyes? Isn't it your eyes that see something and then your heart desires it? And the Medrash answers and says, no, that's really not the way it works. The way it really works is that your heart has the potential, your heart meaning your concern for others, your growing attachment to God, your understanding on a much higher plane that human beings have a responsibility toward one another. Ultimately, that heart can redirect your vision into a healthier, higher way. So when the Torah says, don't seek after the desires of your heart and after your eyes, the Torah is being very specific. It's not that, ooh, that's enticing, I would like to eat that. Oh, it's not kosher, or it's not permissible, or it belongs to someone else, or it's set aside for an offering, or it was purchased for Shabbat dinner and it's only Thursday. Whatever is attracting my eye, that's a natural process, but it's the heart that can override that with your own commitment and your own perspective being developed. And indeed, there's a medrash here on Mishlei. And this is all brought in an introduction to this week's Torah reading by Rabbeinu Bechaya, one of the early commentaries on the Torah. And he says, this sentence in Mishlei is really saying God is speaking to us. And God says ultimately, give me your heart and your eyes so that you will become one with God. Okay? A very clarifying statement here. You know, it's almost explaining the chicken or the egg, which comes first. The heart needs to be developed first. And as a person becomes more heartfelt, more broad-minded, more seeking out God in the world, more aware of the needs of other people in addition to their own needs, that actually elevates the actual vision itself. And therefore, a person's heart becomes dominant over the eyes, and not the other way around. So a person can develop a sense of self-control. This brings us to the beginning, the very beginning of this week's Torah reading, which is chapter 21, sentence 10, and it's a very unusual section in the Torah. Ki Teze milchama al ovecha, when you will go out to war against your enemies. Hashem, your God, will deliver the enemies into your hands. You'll captives, you'll acquire captives. And the next sentence, 11, and you will see among the captivity a woman who is beautiful of form, and you will desire her. And the Torah has a system, because the Torah does recognize that in the midst of war and killing and survival and all the extreme conditions that take place when people are involved in war, and we know that historically rape and abuse of women, and I'm not talking about being used as a tool of war, we're not talking about that here, but we're talking about the proclivity that a soldier whose life has been alive and who narrowly escapes and is on the winning side will tend to become abusive to all the captives and all the people around them, the civilians, the people who haven't been engaged in combat. That's a natural tendency. And indeed, the rabbis say that this is an exception to propriety, because lo dibra Torah ela keneged yetzer hara, that because a person's evil inclination here is perhaps on the verge of being uncontrollable, so the Torah makes an allowance here, and it really has a process where, a person could say, okay, I have tremendous desire for this woman in captivity. She's not Jewish. She was, she's part of, quote unquote, the spoils of war, so to speak. So the Torah says, okay, you're not allowed to abuse her. You have a whole process of shaving her head, cutting her fingernails. In other words, making you aware that visual lure that attracted you and that moved you and that evoked your desire, you have to go through a process of seeing past that and through that over a period of 30 days after the battle stops. And then if you still feel an interest in her and marrying her, you can marry her. And the truth is, you can marry her even if she's not wholehearted in her acceptance of Judaism. She can become your wife, and she has to be treated as a full wife. But understand that you're going down a pathway which doesn't have a pristine beginning, and therefore it's bound to have a lousy outcome. So hence, how do the dominoes fall? The next section of the Torah is, if a person has two wives, one is beloved and one is hated, and he has children, he's not allowed to give precedence to the children of the wife he loves over the one he doesn't. And here Rashi connects the narrative in a way and says, look, understand something, that if this is the basis of which your marital union is formed in the midst of uncontrolled desire and battle, you're going to see over time that the lure will wear off on you. You will reach a point of more spiritual equilibrium, and you're bound to be in a position where you have a wife who you don't truly love. Because at the beginning, it's not a prophecy, but it's just saying, Rashi says it's likely to happen. And therefore, that creates complications in the family. And again, it's the antithesis of what we said about the returning of the lost object, where a person will become elevated, will become more caring, more concerned, society will be uplifted. Here, the Torah is really giving us a prescription saying, be careful, be understanding, use foresight, see past the superficial shine that you see in front of you, and foresee whether this is a path that going down this path is really going to lead to a more fulfilling life, which is what the lure of your eyes is telling you will be the case. Give yourself more time to sort it out. Perhaps you could avoid it. If you can't avoid it, there's a permissible channel here, but understand that there are likely consequences down the road of a person finding themselves as the head of a household with a lack of harmony. And of course, what's the next paragraph? If a person will have a wayward and rebellious child who does not hearken to the voice of his father and the voice of his mother, and they discipline him, but he does not hearken to them. And this is chapter 21, begins at sentence 18. So we have what we call here a ben sorer or mora, an utterly rebellious child. And the fact is that the parents bring the child to the Beis Din, to the court investigates, and if that's the case, the child is actually executed. Why? Not because of what the child has done already, because after all, the child has just reached maturity, but rather because we foresee that this child will be a major detriment towards society. And as the rabbis say, it's better that we execute this person while they're still innocent than allow them to wreak havoc on society and kill other people and make disrupt the harmony of life and then be killed ultimately with guilt on their head. Now, there's an interesting caveat here, because if you look at the words of the sentence, it requires the parents to turn over the child. And what the recent Balei Musar, the people who look at the human dynamics, and they take this out of the Talmudic discussion, is that if the parents see the exact same behavior in their child, but they don't construe it as being hopeless, antisocial, whatever label we want to put on it, but rather they remain hopeful and willing to work with their child and convey love to their child, that itself can exempt a child from the consequences that this section is talking about. And by the way, the Talmud seems to say that this never really took place. It's all theoretical. But in any event, what you see here, and the way it's explained, is as long as there are people in the world who believe in this child, who when they look at this child see not only the evil and the superficial wrong and the out of control human being that in fact this child is, but they also see the sparks of goodness and they interact with the child in a loving, hopeful way, then there's no reason to turn them over to the court, because there's still a good likelihood that this love and expectation for goodness will prevail and the child will find the right path in life and become an upstanding citizen in the world. So what do we see from here? Again, I'm talking about vision. So there's two different sets of parents, in theory, could each have a child who's behaving the same way. One set of parents can't see past the negative, the disruptiveness, the drunkenness, the gluttony of the child, and therefore within them, their vision of the child as a worthwhile human being disappears, and that creates a hopeless situation. And at least in theory, we say better to dispense with this person while the person's still innocent, rather than wait for the person to bring the consequence of death upon themselves. Okay, theoretical idea. But so long as the parent's vision can, once again, just like a soldier could see past the allure of the beautiful captive and come to understand that this is not a fitting life partner for me, so too the parents in the opposite direction can see past the gluttony and drunkenness and irresponsibility of their child and remain hopeful, committed parents who see that who are devoting themselves, that we know our love and our faith in this child is going to conquer all. Then we also hold out hope for the child, and the child becomes exempt from this whole category. So it's an amazing thing in terms of what our eyesight sees. And I want to just circle back now to two things in conclusion. If you go back to the lost object here, and the Chatam Sofer, and actually it's more often quoted from the Chafetz Chaim, the rabbi who passed away in 1932. He says that if the Torah expects me to have a vision, I walk down the street and I'm busy. I've got an appointment at 9:00. I'm in a rush. I've got to get someplace. But the Torah still expects me to notice, oh, is that my neighbor's animal running free, jumped out of the fence, there's a breach somewhere. Let me take the time, redirect my efforts, let me interrupt my course of action so that I can rescue that animal, return it to its rightful owner, and see to it that the other person doesn't suffer a loss. How much more so do I need to be aware of the spiritual status and direction of all my friends and everyone in my family, and be sensitive to the idea that I need to see around me where other people need a boost, they need to be redirected. And I'm not talking about becoming a zealot, walking around with a stick and breaking everybody's leg because you think that they're talking Lashon Hara too much or they're doing something that you think is wrong. I'm talking about a person taking upon their shoulders a responsibility that my field of vision is going to be wide. And in any way that I can boost someone's spirits, any way that I can encourage someone to do good, and in any way I can encourage a person to live on a higher plane, that's within my field of vision, and I'm going to involve myself in doing so. And that's where the Chavetz Chaim translates this mitzvah of seeing a lost sheep in the beginning of chapter 22 on a much broader scale. And it's be truly a good neighbor and a good friend and a good family member and a good classmate, whatever the situation is, a good work colleague. So that if you see someone who's depressed, unhappy, and again, I would point out that was the interaction between Joseph when the two ministers of the king were thrown into prison. He noticed that they were troubled. Now he was troubled. He was locked in prison, for years at a time. He was in a hopeless situation. You would think you'd be sitting and saying, woe is me, I'm in a terrible position, I'm cut off from my father and from my brothers, I've been sold down the river. But no, he had the field of vision which could notice that these lofty ministers of Paro who had been thrown into prison, they were disturbed by something, and each one told them the dream that they had, and he explained the dream, and he encouraged the one who the dream indicated would be rescued. And ultimately, that minister of the king did play a role in getting him out of prison and letting him become the viceroy of Egypt. So again, you see how precious it is to Hashem for us to maintain this type of level of awareness and sensitivity, and to include that within our scope of vision in the world around us. And I just want to end again with just a tribute to Rabbi Beryl Wine, Zichrono Livrocha, who passed away 2 weeks ago. Amongst his many, many contributions and among his last few books that he wrote, he was talking so much about how historians, a secular historian, doesn't connect dots and doesn't see the interrelationship of God's hand in history, so to speak, and that we, with the Torah telling us that we have an obligation to have a memory and to understand the past for the benefit of how we behave in the future, we have that responsibility. And hence he brought a love to teaching history, and he never tired of pointing things out. And I'll just give you one example of it. He was talking about the beginning of Zionism in a talk. And he said, so what happens? He says the Jewish people were in a very downtrodden, we're tuned into like the 1870s. Jewish people were in terrible shape. The Tsar is persecuting the Jews in Russia. There's tremendous poverty in Eastern Europe. The Jewish people are largely disenfranchised. And what happens? All of a sudden, there's a war between Germany and France. Nothing to do with the Jewish people. What historian would ever connect that to the Jewish people? But we do, because what happened as the outcome of that war? France lost the war badly. They looked to scapegoat why they lost the war. They found the one Jew who was on the general's staff in that war, and he was by far the most junior officer. Rabbi Wein points all this out in a talk he gives in one of his writings, and they blamed everything on him. Okay, so that's not so unusual. So another Jew, Nebuch, was being sent to Devil's Island and torn out of society, not the most unusual occurrence. But of course, it happened to be that a reporter named Herzl was dispatched from Vienna to Paris to cover the trial, and this totally assimilated Jewish man who had nothing to do with the Jewish people, and who was a well-regarded journalist, all of a sudden became aware of his own Jewish identity, and all of a sudden said, we need to create a movement of Zionism so that the Jewish people could once again have the land of Israel as their own. So, like he says, all the events happen like this. And it would be easy, no serious historian would say that perhaps the reason Germany and France went to war was only so that a Herzl could emerge amongst the Jewish people out of nowhere and inspire the Jewish people to have the first Zionist Congress and then the next Zionist Congress, and create an awareness on the part of hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout the world that effort could be made to return back to the land of Israel. So you see, even on an academic level, even in our intellectual understanding of the world, there is a different set of eyes that we can utilize when we look at world events, and we can understand them within the context of the importance of the continuity of Jewish life, the importance of the Jewish people winding our way back toward redemption and reoccupying the land of Israel, and ultimately the successful wrapping up of human history in a way that reflects all the elevation and goodness and a divine plan, and how it comes out of nowhere. And that if you were to sit down even today and try to convince a serious historian that the only reason animosity arose between Germany and France in the 1870s was only for the reason that a Dreyfus would be the scapegoat of the French defeat, and that a Herzl would emerge, and that he would catch the interest of the Jewish people, and he would begin this awareness of returning to Zion, they would all look at you as though you're crazy, you're not a serious person. But then again, how do we really feel if we saw a person walking down the street who was really fixated on wanting to help other people, on wanting to see to it that he was creating or adding to a society where one person really cares about the other and really puts out for the other? We also might think of this person as being, in some ways, out of sync with reality. But that's where we have, as Rabbi Wein would always say, we have a Jewish people who are out of sync with reality throughout history. And no serious historian has ever been able to explain the survival of the Jewish people, because they're not looking at it with those eyes of seeing God's hand shaping the world and seeing God as the present creator and supervisor of human history. And to the extent that we can do so, that we can act upon it, that we can live our lives cognizant of the needs of others and not just ourselves, and that we can live our lives where our hearts become elevated enough that we ourselves can see through the superficial glitter that's so attractive, and can see past that, so that we can in fact see where real meaning will come from, where real value will come from, and how to live our lives in a way that brings about the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people and of the world.